questions and answers with discussion. Our purpose in this series is to engage your mind and answer the questions that you and other thinking people like you are asking. And then afterwards we talk about it. Now we started with this question, does God even exist? We handled that one on June 16th. Then we talked about guilt and who can say what's right or wrong. Then this was a great one. I had a lot of feedback from you on this one. I mean, of all the religions in the world, how can you say one religion is right and the others are wrong? There can't be just one true religion. Last week's sermon got the most response of all four that I did. How can you say Jesus is the only way to God and heaven? How can you possibly defend such an assertion? And I shared some things in that sermon that some of you had simply never thought of and didn't know at all. And so that one of the four I've done so far, by far, got the most feedback. If you want to listen to any of the previous four sermons in the series, just go to our webpage. It's on your bulletin. It's www.fardaletrinitychurch.org. You can go and look at it, and you'll hear more. You can listen to it. Now, what we're going to talk about today is this question. Hasn't science disproved miracles in Christianity? But what I want to do is also give you a sneak preview. Many of you have this brochure, and if you don't have it, you can pick it up on the way out. It's a brochure telling you all the questions we're going to cover in the date. Like next week, here's a good question. You ought to come to this one. Isn't the Bible culturally and socially regressive? I mean, look what it teaches about women. And what about sexual morality? Kind of prudish and puritanical, isn't it? And what about homosexuality? I mean, isn't the Bible like so socially regressive we can put it away finally? And how was it written anyway, and by whom? And why do Christians think it's historically reliable and accurate? That's what we're going to cover on the 28th. Here's a great question. The all-good, all-powerful God allows an awful lot of suffering and evil in this world. Could you explain that? That's a great question. And then what right do you have to tell me how to live my life? Aren't all the rules of Christianity restrictive of my freedom? Why would I give up my freedom? And if religion is such a good thing, how come there has been so much injustice in world history on account of religion? And why would a loving God send people to hell forever? So these are the dates. This is the brochure. I invite you to take a look at it. Now, what I want to do today is just address this question with you. This one. Hasn't science disproved miracles in Christianity? And why would anyone believe that the miracle stories in the Bible? I mean, everyone knows they're just legends, right? Well, the way this question comes out, it's the same question, but it comes out in different ways, like this one. How can any rational person believe the miracles in the Bible? Or, aren't miracles impossible? We know this in the scientific age. The natural laws govern the universe, and miracles are impossible. Come on. And we know they're just myths and legends, don't we? Passed down from one generation to another around the campfire, and so all the miracles attributed to Jesus, they really didn't happen. They just kind of, to foster faith and to bolster faith in the next generation. This story, kind of like when you go fishing. I caught a fish, and the next time you tell the story, how big's the fish? And the next time you tell the story, how big's the fish? And before you know it, and I had the world record bass on my line, and it was really a guppy. Well, the story evolves and changes and develops. That's the theory, right? And this is a good one. If miracles really did happen back in Bible times, why don't they happen today? How about that one? So what I want to do is try to help you think this through logically. And the first thing you need to understand is dominoes. When you're a kid, you set up the dominoes. And if you get the dominoes set up right, you do this. What happens to the second one? And then what happens to the third one? Right. This issue is all contingent on that first domino and how your worldview has set the dominoes up. And what I'm going to show you is, if you believe there's a God, then belief in a miracle is not this big problem. But if your premise is there is no God, then there cannot be a God who does miracles. So that's basically the idea I want to leave you with, this idea of dominoes. What I want you to understand, though, is when you read the Bible, Old Testament, New Testament, you read about these miracles, commonly it is thought that people back then were just so gullible they believed anything. Not so. You were to read their literature. We unearthed their architecture. I mean, it's true that, people back then had brains and intelligence just like people do today. Man back then isn't any less intelligent than he is today. What man has today is technology. You might even argue that modern man is not as smart as man back then. Ask your teenager to do fractions. They don't know how to do fractions. The computer does it for me. You can't say that people back then, because they lacked technology, didn't have intelligence. Not so at all. They were not gullible. They didn't believe stuff that was not believable. I mean, look at Jesus' apostles. The women show up, Jesus is risen from the dead. That's nonsense. They didn't believe. Even Thomas, he comes back. The 10 said, we saw Jesus, he was here. He said, I don't believe you guys. Unless I put the finger where the nail hole was, put my hand in the hole in the side, I'm not believing. So even the apostles' initial reaction to the miracle of Jesus' resurrection, and that's the biggie, was no way. They were skeptical about it. But we know these people were not gullible. They didn't have technology. They had architecture and literature that we still marvel at today. They weren't gullible, that's my point. Now, how would you respond? Suppose you're out fishing in a boat, the nearest land is several miles away, and someone comes walking on the water. What would you respond? Or some friend of yours, you have known this person since they were born, they're a beggar, they grow up in your town, they're blind, and someone gives them sight just by touching them and saying, be healed. Or you were at someone's bedside when they died. You were there for the wake, you were there for the funeral, you saw the interment, and 4 days later that person is alive. Okay. Honestly, how do you think you would respond? I know how I would respond. I would look for a rational reason. I know I would. That's just the way I am. I would look for a natural explanation before I would assume a miracle happened. I would do historical inquiry and research. It doesn't mean that I have no faith. It just means that I just have an inquiring mind. Like I love Doubting Thomas. I don't even call him Doubting Thomas. I call him Honest Thomas. Because he honestly had questions and he wanted evidence and answers. There's everything right with that. How would you respond? That's how they responded back then. Their initial response to claims of miracles was not to believe them. Case in point, they didn't believe that Jesus had risen from the dead, even though eyewitnesses said it. They needed to see him for themselves. So the second thing I want you to understand is that if there are no natural explanation for an event, would you then be willing to say something beyond the laws of nature is at work here? You'd call it a miracle. But here we get to the problem of science. Science says no miracles can happen, right? Well, the nature of scientific proof happens to limit the scientific method as a tool for discovering truth, right? The scientific method has restricted itself to the observable laws of science. So if something happens outside those laws, it can't really address it. The scientific method for discovering truth is limited to something that is repeatable and verifiable through experimentation. Like I talked to you about the boiling point of water. You can test that. Or you can do an experiment. I did an experiment once. I was 9 years old, and I just couldn't understand how flame would not be extinguished in a fluid. So in my garage at age 9, I conducted an experiment. By the time I was done, there was 2 fire trucks. I had to go into the burning building and save my little brother. I torched the place. I just did an experiment that went awry and amiss. When you drop a flame into paint thinner, it really does burn. I didn't understand fumes and molecules becoming gases, evaporation quickly from certain fluids. I understand it now. My point is, when you, my mother, God bless her, there's a special place in heaven for my mother. You can repeat something, do an experiment and verify it, but how do you do that with something that defies the laws of and the limits of the scientific method? Right? A miracle, by definition, is an event that is so radically different from an ordinary operation of nature that its observers are correct in attributing it to the intervention of something else, be it God or some supernatural thing going on. That's what a miracle is. It breaks the laws of nature as we observe them. Now, let me go back. I hit that too hard. God created the universe, and he sets up the laws of nature, but he is not bound by them. He is not bound. If God can create the universe out of nothing, he can certainly overstep the laws that he has set up to govern it. See, it's the first domino. If there is a God who can create all this, there is a God who can control all this, there is a God who is not bound by all this. He can supersede the laws of nature if we want to. So roll back the tape to the first lesson of this series. How can we even know there's a God? Does God even exist? Well, go listen to that sermon and you'll see why I'm convinced there is a God. So because there is a God, the second domino falls. He can go beyond the laws of nature when he chooses to. And here's where we get to the first domino. Your premise, that is your presupposition, is the key issue. Your premise is the key issue. If your premise is that it's impossible for any force outside the universe to intervene in the universe, then what will your conclusion be? Miracles are not possible. That's because you've already decided that God doesn't exist. That's the atheist position. Then you won't believe he does miracles. You won't believe the miracles in the Bible. Or if you're agnostic, or if you're deist, whatever it is, if you accept the fact of God's existence, but you think he can't or doesn't interfere with life on earth, that's deism, then you won't believe that he does miracles. You won't believe the miracles in the Bible. Let's go back to the first domino. Is there a personal God who can and does interact? If the answer is yes, miracles are possible. If the answer is no, then they're not. The key issue is the existence of God. If God exists and created the universe, then there is a dimension to reality beyond the physical laws of nature. There is a supernatural dimension to reality. Miracles are possible since or because God's there. Now, the reason people don't believe it is Darwinian evolution, right? Darwinian evolution comes along and explains life minus God. Did everything from nothing in the 6 literal days that the Genesis 1 and 2 say. God made all life forms in 6 24-hour days just several thousand years ago. That happens to be the position I hold for a lot of reasons outside the Bible. The second one is theistic evolution. God created life, and he guided natural selection to develop the complex life forms from the simple ones. So it says, yes, evolution happened, and God guided it. It wasn't without design. It wasn't minus intelligence. It was God's design and God's intelligence, and all we have done is we have discovered the mechanism God used. That's okay, that's cool. Another is progressive evolution. God performed large-scale creative acts at different points over longer periods of time. Good Christians who love Jesus with all their heart and believe the Bible hold this view, one of these 3 views. So, to say I don't believe in God because of evolution is like, there's a lot of Christians who believe evolution is the mechanism God used. To say I don't believe the miracles in the Bible because of evolution is like, dude, a lot of people believe in God, believe he can do miracles, and just think that evolution is the process that he guided. So evolution is not the trump card that beats all in this discussion. A lot of Christians believe it. I don't happen to, but others do. In fact, one of the things that Richard Dawkins says and Daniel Dennett says is that no one can believe in a God and believe in science. Well, he says that very, very strongly, and even he's nasty when he says it. And the way he defends the view, if you address it, well, what about? He just repeats it louder and slower. So that's not a really good defense of your view. But he's one of the new atheists, and they're hostile, they're caustic, their interactions are demeaning and belittling, and they're in your face. Intellectually, they're not 1/10 the challenge that the old atheists were. They're just belligerent and yelling and nasty. And in a generation that doesn't read, that doesn't write, that simply goes by sound bites, they get press and they get believed. If you win the debate, if you crack a joke, you win the debate. How does that work? What about the content and the substance of the issues? Well, even in our political campaigns, that's a moot point. Who even cares about that? And the same thing applies, because the problem is our culture at large. Here's a survey of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. It's done by the Pew Research Center in 2009. What they surveyed was religious belief among members of the group. Now, when Dawkins did his survey, his question, which is designed to influence the outcome, is how many of you believe God personally communicates with people today? And he came up with another only 7%. Okay, but that's a different question than how many of you believe there's a God, isn't it? I mean, if you said to me, God personally communicated to me, I'd say, well, wait a minute. You have the Bible and you have the Holy Spirit, but you're telling me God appeared to you and talked to you? If you told me that, I might doubt it. And I'm a Christian pastor. So that you get only 7% responding yes to that, I think, is not evidence of anything. But according to Hawkins and Dennett, they say that's evidence that you can't be a Christian, have a brain, and be a scientist. Here's the real facts. Look at this. When you do this thing, who believes in God? Who doesn't believe in God, but does believe in a universal higher power? Meaning, okay, it's not the God of Christianity, but it is a higher power. Who doesn't believe in either God or a higher power? And who doesn't know, agnostic, or didn't answer the question? Here's the fact. Only 41% of the scientists in this group say this: I don't believe in God or a higher power. 7% say, I don't know. 33 believe in God the way you and I understand him, a personal God, and 18% say higher power. So if you combine these two, you get like 51%. So over half of the scientists in the American Association for the Advancement of Science believe in God or a higher power. So the whole point that you can't be a theist or a believer in a God and a scientist, this is so totally bogus, but it gets a lot of play and a lot of press depending on who the speaker is. It's simply not true. And a lot of scientists who really believe there is a God and he designed it, and you ought to read their books, Jastrow, Polkinghorne, there's a ton of them. The guy who was the molecular biologist from Lehigh University, Michael Behe, wrote a book called Darwin's Black Box, The Biochemical Challenge to Evolution. It's an awesome book. Or the guy who was the head of the Human Genome Project, a guy named Francis Collins, and in his book, and John Polkinghorne. I mean, I got the books here. I brought a bunch with me, and that's not all of them. I have more. If you want to read cutting-edge 21st century scientists who believe with all their heart there is a God who is there, and he's personal and he's interactive, I got the books for it. They'll never show you those books in your junior high, your high school, or your college curriculum, though. They'll only give you Dennett and Hawking and Richard Dawkins. So where do we go? How do you proceed in this discussion if you want a modern man to believe that there is such a thing as a miracle? Well, what you do is historical inquiry and converging lines of evidence. Remember what I told you is you believe things that you don't have empirically verifiable evidence for, but you accept lines of evidence. And the example I used was, how many of you believe there is an airport in Teterboro? Well, and a bunch of you would say, yeah, okay. Let me see. How many of you believe there's an airport in Teterboro? How many of you believe there is not an airport in Teterboro? Okay, how many of you have been there and watched planes land and watch them take off? Now, here's the real question. How many of you have not been to Teterboro Airport and seen planes take off and land? Raise your hand higher. Okay, there's a bunch of you who have not been there and seen it, and yet you're the same people who raised your hand and said you believe it's there. Well, why do you believe it's there if you haven't seen it with your own two eyes? Because you have accepted enough converging lines of evidence that it's there. Like you've seen it advertised in the paper, you've seen smaller planes flying in and out of the air, they got to be landing somewhere. You may have a friend who works for a taxi service that drops people off there. You may have seen advertisement for it in the paper. There are enough lines of evidence that they don't go all the way and touch it, but you believe it's there. Another question, how many of you believe the boiling point of water is 212 degrees at sea level? That's interesting. That's all. How many of you don't believe the boiling point of water is 212 degrees at sea level? Oh, good. You all believe it. Now we go back. Why? Have you put a thermometer in and have you done the test at sea level? Well, most of you haven't. I have. How many of you believe if you drop a flame into a liquid, it might not necessarily extinguish? I could do an experiment with you. We want to torch the church. There are many things in your life that you believe, even though you don't have yourself empirically verifiable proof for it. You accept lines of evidence that point to it. And that's the only way to do anything from the past, historical inquiry. How many of you believe George Washington sailed across the river on Christmas Eve and attacked at Trenton and then moved over to Princeton? Well, you could study your history and decide whether or not you believe it, but there's certainly enough document evidence that you would believe it. How many of you believed Hannibal moved through the Alps with all those elephants? Well, I believe it. How many of you believe Alexander crossed the Granicus River in 332 BC? Can you prove it? No, but you accept a certain amount of lines of evidence to say it is reasonable beyond doubt that this event happened. And that's what you have to do with all of these type issues. Historical inquiry, lines of evidence, disprove the legend, myth, theory. The first thing you want to do is consider the reliability of the document you're looking at. Is it true on the other things you can verify? And that's where the New Testament shines. Critical scholars say Luke is one of the straight-up best historical, most reliable documents in all of antiquity. The Gospel of Luke. Consider the reliability of the document. If you have a document that is historically reliable on everything you can verify, then you have to give the guy benefit of the doubt that when he describes something else that he's accurate there too. Or at least you would say we have no reason to doubt him. And so when Luke records a miracle in the same way and in the same passage where he records some historical fact, you have to give the guy the benefit of the doubt. Second, you want to consider three things: timing, content, and literary form of the Gospels versus the centuries of myth and legend theory. Now, remember the Jesus Seminar, real big in the middle of the 20th century, really was rolling strong in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s. The Jesus Seminar said that here's how we got the four Gospels. Jesus dies. His beleaguered followers, they're very emotionally attached to him. Now he's gone. They have dreams about him. They talk about their dreams. This happens to people today who lose loved ones. They'll have a dream about him and talk about it. Well, over the campfire and nighttime, and you talk about the kids, the Jesus legends grew and the myths, and then pretty soon we got him walking on water and healing the blind. And geez, by the 4th century, it's like he's a god. And for political reasons, the politicians declare it so. That's the Da Vinci Code. The problem is, while it's bills itself as fact, it's fiction. It's like Mary Poppins or the Wizard of Oz. It's not at all fact. I did a 4-part sermon series responding to the Da Vinci Code a few years ago, and I showed you massive volumes of documents from the first 3 centuries where even pagan emperors state that they worship Jesus as God. It was so commonly known that the Christians believed Jesus was God. It's absurd for people like Dan Brown and the Da Vinci Code to say no one believed it to the 4th century. So the whole Jesus seminar, that the way you got the Gospels, the way you got the 35 miracles of Jesus in the New Testament Gospels, was all legend, and it's all to bolster the Jesus myth. That's the Jesus seminar. Yeah, the thing about the Jesus seminar is almost everyone now knows it's a bunch of baloney. The Jesus seminar theory about the origin of the 4 Gospels has been nuked. It's now widely recognized as speculative history. You know what speculative history is? I won't even use that word in the sanctuary. Speculative history means there is no basis for it. It is complete imagination and speculation, and that's what they've largely concluded. It's built on almost entirely speculation and imagination. Its major tenets and arguments are built on assumptions which have no or little data at all. So the Jesus seminar is largely was real popular and cool, and that's a fad that's now gone. But the results of it dominate in universities. Almost everyone who goes to college gets the Jesus seminar view of the origin of the Gospels. Totally bogus. They don't know that, though, because how many of you, even in high school, by the time you get to college, have read the church fathers from the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd centuries? No, almost no one. So you don't know that the Jesus seminar is all baloney. Here's the main thing about why we know the Gospels are not legends. The timing is too early for the Gospels to be legends, right? The earliest accounts of the resurrection that we have in writing are Paul the Apostle's letters. They're written 15 to 20 years after the resurrection. Okay, if the resurrection takes place in 33 AD, and within 15 to 20 years, we have letters, not the Gospels yet, letters that talk about the resurrection. Galatians is written in 48, Thessalonians in 50, Corinthians in 54. So the claim that the resurrection stories developed over decades as myth and legends and were later incorporated into the Gospels is simply baseless. In these verses, you can look at them. Paul, an apostle, not sent from men, nor through the agency of man, but through Jesus Christ and God the Father, who raised him from the dead. Uh-oh, that's 48 AD. I thought no one believed that until the 4th century. How about this one? Written in 50, I delivered to you as of first importance which I received, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, he was raised on the 3rd day. How about this? To wait for a son from heaven whom he raised from the dead. That's Jesus who rescues us from the coming wrath. If we believe that Jesus died and rose again, God will bring him with those who have fallen asleep. That's Thessalonians, written in 54. I thought no one even believed or thought or passed that myth around until centuries later. No, these circulated in the lifetime of the eyewitnesses. So you see, that whole theory about myth and legend, miracles in the Bible, that's a bunch of baloney. The stories of the myth and the legends, they were real. The stories of the miracles are not myth and legend. It's real, and it's spreading around within 15 to 20 years during the lifetime of the eyewitnesses of the events. The Gospels were not written centuries after the events either. Those other three things I cited for you are not Gospels, they're letters. The Gospels are actually much earlier than 4th century. Scholars date Matthew at around 50, Mark at 57 to 59, Luke at 58 to 60. Some say the Gospel of John as early as 45, others as late as 85 or 90. But folks, the Gospels, complete with all of their miracles, are popularly accepted and spread all over the Roman Empire by the end of the 1st century. So much for the theory. It took 4 centuries to develop these myths, huh? And you could read the sermons and the theological discussions of what is called the Church Fathers. I have a whole set, like the Encyclopedia Britannica, called the Ante-Nicene Fathers, means the Church Fathers' writings before the Council of Nicaea in 325. I love reading that stuff. And they talk about the deity of Christ and his resurrection and his miracles all the time. And the guy died in 160. So all of this discussion is happening before that. All the Gospels were written by or with the help of eyewitnesses and circulated in the second half of the 1st century during the lifetime of the eyewitnesses. Nukes that whole theory that this is, 3rd and 4th century myth. The book of Acts is written as a sequel to the Gospel of Luke, and Paul states while he's on trial before King Agrippa that the gospel facts and his conversion and ministry are public knowledge. Here it is. So having obtained help from God, I stand this day testifying to small and great, saying nothing but what the prophets and Moses said was going to take place, that the Christ was to suffer and that by reason of his resurrection from the dead, he would be the first to proclaim light to Jewish people and Gentiles. While Paul was saying this in his defense, Festus said in a loud voice, Paul, you're out of your mind. Your great learning is driving you mad. But Paul said, I'm not out of my mind, most excellent Festus, but I utter words of sober truth. For King Agrippa knows about these matters. I speak to him with confidence, since I am persuaded none of these things escape his notice. It has not been done in a quarter. This was common knowledge. King Agrippa knew all about this Jesus stuff and his resurrection from the dead and his miracles. They all knew about it. The 4 Gospels record 35 of Jesus' miracles. Demonstrate his authority over nature, disease, demons, and death, and he did the miracles publicly. He did it before thousands of eyewitnesses, many of whom were his enemies. Rather than deny the miracles, his enemies accused him of using demonic powers to perform them. That's called a hostile witness. The hostile witnesses agreed that he did it. They didn't deny that. In fact, when the Pharisees heard it, they said, this man cast out demons by Beelzebub, the ruler of demons. Peter pointed out the undeniable fact that Jesus' miracles were done when he preached Christ. Men of Israel, listen to these words. Jesus the Nazarene, a man attested to you by God with miracles and wonders and signs, which God performed through him in your midst, as you yourselves know. Folks, there is no way you can read the early documents and conclude that the miracles of Jesus are later additions in the 3rd and 4th century. That whole legend myth thing is a bunch of baloney. The fact is, the timing of the Gospels and the other documents is way too early for the time to have passed for tall tales and legends to have developed. And the Gnostic Gospels that are treated like this is the truth. The earliest one is the Gospel of Thomas, dated at about 175. It's not even in Greek, it's in Syriac. And the other Gospels were already widespread and accepted by then. Just don't believe all that nonsense they tell you. Oh, and this guy is great too. I'm in trouble here. Irenaeus of Lyon in AD 160, he said there are 4 and only 4. 4 and only 4 Gospels. So the early church only ever had 4. It wasn't until the 2nd century when others started writing under pseudonyms and trying to turn Christianity, to blend it into paganism and do syncretism. That's the rise of the Gnostic writings, much later. The second thing I want you to see is the content is too counterproductive for the Gospels to be legends. Let's face it. If in the 3rd or 4th century you're going to go back and rewrite the history of Jesus and put in legendary stuff, well, Jesus in those Gospels doesn't take sides in the debates that were going on in the early church. The early church had a lot of debates and issues between 100 and 300. If you were writing the Gospels after that date, wouldn't you put in the mouth of Jesus things that would support your view? I think yes, and Tim Keller points this out. The Gospel accounts do not have Jesus taking sides in the debates that went on in the early church, as you would expect if the Gospels were written during that era. I think he has a good point. Legend certainly would not evolve a Jesus who died as a criminal on a cross executed by the Romans. Wouldn't evolve a Jesus who asked if there's another way to accomplish his mission. Father, if there's another way. Remember in the Garden of Gethsemane? Certainly not a Jesus who cries out on the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me? I mean, if you're going to write a legend of Jesus, why would you put that in it? Kind of counterproductive, wouldn't you say? And women. Certainly women would not have been the first eyewitnesses to the resurrection if you were going to be writing this history a couple hundred years later. The witness of women was not even visible in court in those days. Their testimony is included in gospel accounts only because that's exactly what happened. But if the story were fabricated later, surely the first witnesses would have been men. And the apostles and church leaders, if you were writing the history a couple hundred years later, would you show your founders and your leaders to be a bunch of scared, slow-witted cowards who denied even knowing Jesus with cursing and swearing and fled away? Would you put in there the things about how they're petty and jealous and competing for power? No. If you were doctoring the accounts and writing them later to get people to believe, you would not have put in such things. Folks, the fact is, the 4 canonic Gospels don't suck up to any popular view or the powers that be. It's the Gnostic Gospels that do that. The Gospel accounts record eyewitness testimony and actual history, not doctored accounts, not myths, and not legend. They're just too realistic. And this is what literary critic C.S. Lewis observes. The Gospels are too detailed in minutiae to be legend. Ancient fiction was not realistic like modern fiction is. Ancient fiction included details only for the purpose of developing the character and the plot. Modern fiction, only about the last 300 years, includes irrelevant details in order to add to the realism of the story. Unnecessary details, though, are all over the 4 Gospels we have in the Bible. Why? Because the New Testament Gospels are the written records of eyewitnesses. And eyewitnesses to events just tell you what they remember from it. See the point he's making? The kind of fiction we have nowadays that reads like reality because it has all the inconsequential details was unknown in the history of literature until about 300 years ago. That's the point he's making. So C.S. Lewis says, doesn't work. You can't say the 4 Gospels are later stories written. The fact is, ancient fiction wasn't realistic like modern fiction, yet the 4 Gospel accounts, it reads like an eyewitness account, very realistic. And recollective memory is selective, and it often contains irrelevant details. You know, why do they record in John chapter 20 that they gathered up the net and there was 153 fish? Voluminous allegories. You know why I think it? Because that's how many was in there, and they counted them because they were fishermen, and they knew there was 153 because they were going to go sell them. There's no particular theological thing going on there. It's how many they had. Why did the little boy, why is it recorded that the little boy came with 5 loaves and 2 fishes, or was it 2 loaves and 5 fishes, whatever? Because that's how many there was. Tons of details, and that's what an eyewitness remembered. 20th century speculative historians assume against the evidence that the early Christians would have felt comfortable changing tales from the past. Believe me, they did pass down their history in writing and in oral form, but they didn't feel free to just change it willy-nilly, as they say. They don't even feel free to do that in modern times. You go to cultures now that don't have much writing, they have their stories from the past, and they don't add to them every generation. In African cultures, which even in modern times rely on oral transmission of stories in history, fictional legends and historical accounts are clearly distinguished from each other, and much greater care is taken to preserve the historical accounts. That's even in modern times in these cultures where their language is not written, where it's oral transmission. The timing is far too early for the Gospels to be legends. They can't be 300 or 400 years of myth passed down orally around the campfire. We have the written documents within 15 years of the resurrection. The content is too counterproductive for the Gospels to be legends. If you were going to write a legend, you wouldn't write Jesus crying out from the cross, why have you forsaken me? You wouldn't have the church leaders denying him and being cowards and petty and jealous. You certainly wouldn't have women as the eyewitnesses to the first of the resurrection. And the literary form of the Gospels is simply too detailed to be a legend. I have so much more on this. Here's the conclusion. The oral legends passed down around the fire over decades of century theory has been completely discredited by careful scholarship and common sense. No one believes that anymore, except university professors who preach it to your freshmen in college. Here's the deal. What the university is going to try to do to your kids with all of its might, it's going to try to make them theologically atheist and sexually immoral. It's a 1-2 punch. The classroom and the dorm life will do everything it can to turn your kid into a good little sexually immoral atheist. That's what's happening. That's the fact. Even secular magazines know this. In fact, I was reading, I think it was U.S. News and World Report. The title was Dorm Brothel. They're not Christian. Even they understand what's going on. Think about it. What about miracles today? Well, God used miracles to authenticate the messengers and messages he sent as being from him back then. God intended the miracles to confirm in people's hearts and minds that the message and the messenger were indeed heaven sent and therefore should be heard and heeded. Here's just some scripture to back this up. God, after he spoke long ago to the fathers and the prophets in many portions and in many ways, in these last days has spoken to us in his Son, whom he appointed heir of all things, and through whom also he made the world. For this reason we must pay closer attention to what we have heard, so that we may not drift away from it. For if the words spoken through angels proved unalterable, and every transgression and disobedience received a just penalty, how will we escape if we neglect so great a salvation? After it was at the first spoken through the Lord Jesus, it was confirmed to us by those who heard, that's the apostles, God also testifying with them both by signs and wonders and various miracles and gifts of the Holy Spirit. The message came, God authenticated the message and the messenger with miracles. That's the reason. It was never to have a sideshow to pique your curiosity and to make the miracle worker a lot of money. It was never to do that. The miracles were verifiable. It wasn't a troop that came into town with its sick people with it who couldn't walk, talk, or see. Then they got healed and the show moved on to the next stadium. It was, this guy has been in this community all our life. We know him. He's crippled. He begs at the city gate. This guy is blind. We know him. And then Jesus heals them. It is verifiable. It didn't rely on the gullibility of the people. It relied on the fact that the guy has been lame all his life, and now he's leaping. The guy was blind all his life. Now he's seeing. We buried this person 4 days ago. And now he's among us. These were verifiable miracles. The focus of the miracle wasn't the faith of the observer. It was the fact of the event. Verifiable miracles. That's what really grabbed people. And that's the kind that are real. In some cases, people did listen and believe, and in other cases, they refused. There's some scripture to show you people who totally refused to believe even though they saw a miracle. More scripture to show you people who refused to believe even though they saw a miracle. Folks, God used miracles to authenticate the message and the messengers and messages that he sent. With the completion of the writing of the New Testament and the passing of the apostles, church historians record the cessation of miracles. 2nd century church historians, the miracles have ceased. The apostles are gone. The Gospels, the New Testament is written. It is spreading. It's not a new message anymore. It's going out with authority. 2nd century writers confirmed the cessation of the miracles among the churches. Now here's what I say. God can do and still does miracles. but not to authenticate a new messenger as being from him. You don't find that out there right now. Although we do have testimonies of people who pray for healing, and they're healed beyond what doctors can understand and explain. We do have the gospel going to new places like missionaries in Africa and Papua New Guinea and parts of India, and they say miracles are happening. That's the gospel going to a new land and to a new people. So, I have no reason to doubt their word. I believe. But I know when I get a phone call on Pastor, brother so-and-so is coming to the Meadowlands. Why don't you bring your church down? He has a healing ministry? Yes, he can heal. Really? Are you telling me the truth? Like he can heal someone who said, yes, Pastor, he can. Just bring your congregation down to the Meadowlands. How about you meet me on the steps of Children's Hospital in Philadelphia or St. Jude's right here. We'll start at the top floor. We'll empty the building. And then I hear a dial tone. Folks, don't be gullible. Anyone sent from God, publicly walking around and healing the lame, the blind, the deaf, the sick, raising the dead, and preaching the gospel, would be doing miracles verifiable by physical exam and eyewitness. Don't feel bad that you don't believe it when you hear stories unverified. I was at an Alpha conference in Nyack about 10 years ago. They flew in a guest speaker who was awesome and dynamic. He gave this amazing story about how he prayed over a guy who had had his arm chopped off in an accident and the arm grew back. Of course, right after the thing, then he had to fly off to the next speaking engagement. There was no way to verify that story. I would like to have asked for the name and the contact information of the guy with the arm. And then I would have said, could I see your medical records? See, a miracle is only of value if it authenticates the message and the messenger is being sent from God. And that's what they did in the first century. And they were so verifiable. It didn't rely on you with no basis just believing the guy's report. It was verifiable. Those kind of miracles happened in the New Testament. I am not seeing that happening today. It has to be verifiable to really have the punch of a miracle, like the kind Jesus did, like the kind the apostles did. If the Bible records the miracle, you can believe it because it's a historically reliable document and it records it like eyewitnesses saw it and it happened immediately and it wasn't 300, 400 years later, a story that developed through legends over time. Here's the point. The miracles recorded in the Bible are actual history that actually happened. So what we ought to be doing, the Bible is God's message to people. We ought to read it, listen to it, watch it,